If you take, like, a priceless, centuries-old painting out of its heavy, ornate wooden frame,
Hmm.
and you just, pin that exact same canvas to a blank wall using a couple of cheap thumbtacks.
Right, just totally exposed.
Exactly. Exposed. I mean, the paint itself hasn't changed at all. The brush strokes are identical. The image is exactly what it was yesterday.
Yeah.
But your reverence for it, like the way you physically stand in front of it, it completely shifts. Suddenly it feels less like history and more like just another object in the room.
Which is a fascinating psychological blind spot we all share, honestly.
Right. Because we assume the magic of art, or, in the Terry's case, the magic of sports, comes entirely from the subject itself.
Yeah, we focus on the product, not the packaging, even though the packaging actively instructs us on how to consume the product.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
I mean, when you walk into a grand museum, the architecture of the building, the lighting, the heavy frames, they all serve as these silent cues,
Yeah.
telling your brain, like, this matters. Treat this with respect.
So if you remove those cues, the human brain inevitably recalibrates.
Exactly. It downgrades the significance of what it's looking at.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. We are unpacking a pretty massive structural shift today.
We really are.
And we're using a single source document for this. It's a highly evocative excerpt titled Rivalries Rewritten or Ruined.
It's a great piece.
It really is. And our mission here isn't to look at television ratings or revenue sharing or the logistical optimization of sports schedules.
Right. No spreadsheets today.
Right, no spreadsheets.
Right.
We are examining the structural shifts in baseball strictly through the lens of the emotional heartbeat of the sport.
Which is, frankly, the part that actually matters to the people watching.
Exactly. We are looking at what happens to legendary blood feud rivalries when the fundamental league structures change.
And crucially, we're trying to figure out how you explain this to a younger fan.
Yes, someone who is brand new to the sport. Because they look at the new structure and just see a calendar of games,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, they're totally unaware of the historical ghosts that used to haunt the old schedule.
So, okay, let's unpack this, because the author doesn't waste any time getting to the point.
No, they dive right in.
Yeah.
The author takes this dry, administrative topic,
Mm.
like league realignment,
Right.
and treats it as a profound cultural and psychological shift.
It highlights this severe tension between, like, the accumulation of history and the demands of the present.
It forces us to ask a really difficult question. How much of our present enjoyment of a sport is secretly subsidized by historical structures?
Structures that we just take entirely for granted until they're gone.
Exactly.
So the text explicitly states that today we are not talking about box scores or who hit a home run in the bottom of the ninth.
Right.
We are talking about, quote, feelings that last longer than the final score. The author actually calls rivalries the heartbeat of baseball.
I want to break down that specific phrase, actually. Feelings that last longer than the final score.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because for a lot of modern observers, a sporting event is just this discrete, isolated transaction.
Right, it starts at 7, it ends at 10.
Exactly. A winner is mathematically determined, the event ceases to exist, and the slate is wiped clean for tomorrow.
But this text is arguing that the true essence of baseball operates on a completely different timeline.
It does. The underlying engine that sustains the sport across generations, it's not the 3 hours of gameplay.
Right.
Those 3 hours are almost secondary to the lingering emotional resonance that survives for decades.
And calling it a heartbeat is such an intentional choice by the author.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, I mean, a heartbeat isn't something you actively focus on while you're just walking down the street.
Right, it operates entirely in the background.
But it is the underlying rhythm that keeps the entire organism functioning. Without it, the body is just a collection of disconnected parts.
That's a really solid analogy.
Yeah.
And the text defines this heartbeat not by how often teams play each other,
Right, which is counterintuitive.
but by the fact that certain games, quote, mean something beyond the standings. They carry history, emotion, and memory.
Memory is definitely the operative word there. Because think about a brand new fan, right? To them, the standings are the entire universe. You open an app on your phone, you see who has won the most games, and that mathematical hierarchy dictates everything.
Right. If the first place team plays the second place team, it's a big game. Math says so.
Exactly. But for the lifelong fan, the standings are often totally secondary to the historical animosity.
Yeah, they don't care about the math if the hatred is deep enough.
Right. And the text makes a really provocative argument here. It claims that a massive portion of that meaning and memory is tied directly to the physical league structure.
Yes. the actual administrative framework.
But, okay, let's pause there for a second, because that doesn't fully track for me right out of the gate.
How so?
Well, if two teams hate each other and their fan bases hate each other, why does the league structure even matter?
I see what you mean.
Like, if the Yankees and the Red Sox play each other on a baseball diamond, it's still the Yankees and the Red Sox.
Right.
The hatred doesn't just evaporate because some executive in an office changed the name of the division, does it?
It doesn't evaporate overnight, no. But the text argues it slowly starves without the structure to feed it.
Starves. Wow.
Yeah. This brings us back to your painting analogy, actually. The league structure is the frame.
Okay. Right.
Let's look at how the author uses the Yankees and Red Sox as the anchor for this concept. The text states emphatically that when these two teams historically faced off, it was not merely a division matchup.
Right. The author calls it an American League war.
Yes, American League War.
That phrasing carries so much weight. It sounds less like a sporting event and more like, I don't know, a generational territorial conflict.
Because structurally, that is exactly what it was.
What do you mean by structurally?
Well, the American League and the National League were not always just arbitrary labels for different sides of a bracket.
Oh, right. There were actually separate entities.
For the vast majority of baseball history, they were entirely separate legal and functional businesses. They had different presidents.
Wait, really? Different presidents?
Yeah. They had different umpiring crews with entirely different interpretations of the strike zone.
That is wild to think about now.
They even developed different rules of play, the most famous being the designated hitter rule in the American League.
Ah, right. So they were playing slightly different versions of the sport.
Exactly. And crucially, the teams in the American League never, ever played the teams in the National League during the regular season.
They were just totally isolated.
Completely isolated ecosystems. The only time they met was in the World Series, which functioned as a true clash of champions.
So you're saying the isolation is what built the pressure?
Yes, 100%.
Because the Yankees and the Red Sox were locked inside this very specific closed room together for a century.
Right, this closed American League room.
So their rivalry wasn't just about beating a team down the highway. It was about controlling the entire ecosystem.
The structure itself is what made those matchups dense with meaning.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
The text explicitly lists what lives inside this specific structure. It mentions the decades of context, the uniforms, the moments frozen in time, and the October history.
Right.
All of those elements are housed within the construct of the American League. The walls of that league structure kept the pressure building year after year.
So the text is arguing that the history and the memories don't just, like, float in the ether?
No, they are physically attached to the scaffolding of the league's historical format.
Wow. Okay. Without the American League to act as the container, the context of the war just evaporates.
It becomes just two teams playing a series of baseball games.
I see what you're saying. But how do you translate that to a young fan?
That is the challenge, isn't it?
It really is, because if you are someone who just started watching the sport, a game is just a game.
No.
You turn on television, you see two teams in different colored uniforms,
Mm-hmm.
and you evaluate the game based purely on the athletic performance happening in that exact moment.
Because that's all you have access to.
Right. You don't see the ghosts of players from the 1970s hovering over the diamond. You don't feel the weight of a century of American League animosity.
Translating it requires explaining the unseen architecture of fandom.
The unseen architecture. I like that.
You have to explain to that young fan that for the traditionalist, the field is crowded with historical context.
Right.
When a new fan sees a critical pitch thrown in the 8th inning, they just see the physics of a baseball moving toward home plate.
Sure.
But when the lifelong fan sees that exact same pitch, their brain is instantly overlaying it with 20 other identical situations from their childhood.
And their parents' childhoods, too.
Exactly. The grand narrative of the franchise. And the text points out that, quote, the games don't go away. The teams remain the same, but the frame vanishes.
There it is. The painting gets taken out of the ornate wooden frame and put into a cheap plastic border.
Precisely. The rules of baseball haven't changed. The bases are still the same distance apart.
Right.
But the reverence for the event shifts completely because the structural context that instructed the fans to revere it has been dismantled.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of what is happening right now. You know, the dismantling process the text warns about.
Right, the current changes.
The source addresses what happens when these old boundaries are actively erased. It specifically points to a structural shift toward an East versus West model.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to dig into the actual mechanics of this because the text treats this shift as a tragedy, but on paper, it just looks like a logical business decision.
From a purely logistical, administrative, and financial standpoint, shifting to an East versus West model makes perfect sense.
Right.
If you eliminate the historical American League and National League separation and instead just group all 32 teams geographically.
Into an Eastern Conference and a Western Conference.
Right. If you do that, you solve a lot of problems. You drastically reduce travel times.
Which helps the carbon footprint.
Exactly. You ensure that games are played in time zones that maximize local television viewership, which boosts revenue.
That's huge for the networks.
And you streamline the scheduling matrix so teams aren't flying from New York to California for a quick 2-day trip.
But the text is arguing that sports fandom is profoundly illogical.
It is entirely illogical.
But it isn't built on reduced carbon footprints or optimized television schedules. It is built on arbitrary tribalism that has just calcified into deep emotional truth over generations.
Well, exactly it.
So when you shift to an East versus West model, you aren't just making travel easier. You are bulldozing the sacred walls of the old leagues.
You are actively erasing the geographical and structural boundaries that define the legends of the sport.
Right.
And there's a quote here that really serves as the emotional centerpiece of the entire excerpt.
Let's hear.
The author writes, "When you start reshaping rivalries, you're not just changing matchups, you're changing memories."
See, I really struggle with that specific line.
Changing memories.
Yeah. How can changing the schedule for next season retroactively change a memory I have from 20 years ago? The past is the past.
I get why that sounds confusing.
Like a new schedule matrix doesn't reach back in time and alter what actually happened.
It doesn't alter the event, no. But it fundamentally alters the lens through which you view that memory moving forward.
The lens.
Yeah. Think about the psychology of a sports memory. A traditionalist holds onto the memory of a fierce playoff series from 2 decades ago because it represented the absolute pinnacle of the American League mountain.
Okay, yeah. It was the ultimate test of survival within a closed, sacred system.
Right. If the league shatters that system today and says, actually, the concept of the American League is obsolete, it's now just a generic Eastern bracket.
Oh, I see.
You retroactively cheapen the context of those old memories.
Because the American League War ceases to exist as a living concept. It's totally defunct.
Correct. Which means your memories of those wars suddenly feel orphaned.
Orphaned. Wow.
They go from being part of a living, breathing history that connects the past to the present to being dead artifacts from a fallen civilization.
That is so depressing.
The text specifically highlights the loss of league pride here. For decades, the separation of the leagues meant you didn't just root for your local team.
You rooted for your league's entire identity.
Yes. The American League was known for power hitting. The National League was known for strategy and pitching.
And because interleague matchups didn't exist in the regular season.
Exactly. When the 2 leagues finally clashed in October, it was monumental. It felt like 2 different solar systems colliding. The isolation bred the mystique.
But by tearing down that isolation, by mixing everyone together in an East versus West format, you lose the mystique of the unknown.
You lose the rarity.
And the author argues that rivalries aren't built purely on the repetition of playing someone. They are built on what those specific games represent inside a larger, meaningful system. But here is where the text introduces a massive paradox that I really need you to explain, because my logic circuits are failing here.
Ah, the frequency paradox.
Yes, the frequency paradox. The text says that in this new East versus West system, some rivalries actually gain frequency but lose identity.
It does say that.
It states that playing someone more often somehow makes the rivalry mean less.
Right.
How does playing a team more make you know them less?
It's a great question.
Like if I see my neighbor every single morning when I get the mail, I know their face, their routine, and their habits significantly better than if I only see them once a year at a block party.
Sure.
Increased frequency should logically deepen the relationship, shouldn't it?
It deepens familiarity, but it destroys the stakes.
Familiarity versus stakes. Okay.
Familiarity and identity are not the same thing in the context of a rivalry, to use your neighbor analogy.
Please do.
Yes, you see your neighbor every day while grabbing the mail. You know them well. But that interaction is mundane. It's routine. It carries absolutely zero emotional weight.
Right. It's just, hi, how are you?
Exactly. Now imagine you only saw your neighbor once a year at an incredibly high-stakes, highly formalized town hall debate.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And at this debate, You passionately argued over the zoning laws of your neighborhood, and the winner determined the future of your property.
Okay, yeah. The Daily Mail grab is frequent, but it lacks identity and stakes. The annual debate is incredibly rare, but it is dripping with identity and massive consequences.
The author is arguing that when rivalries shift into a geographically optimized format,
Right.
where regional teams play each other constantly just to fulfill a television scheduling quota, the games become the Daily Mail grab.
Oh, that makes so much sense. They transition from being historical events to administrative checkboxes.
Exactly. The identity of the rivalry used to be the rare titanic struggle for league supremacy.
And the new identity is just the team we are forced to play 14 times a summer because their stadium is only a 2-hour flight away.
It completely flattens the relationship.
Which leads us directly into what I think is the most relatable and heartbreaking analogy the author uses.
The song analogy.
Yes. This paradox of frequency-destroying identity brings us to the fundamental question of how we consume the things we love.
It's universally applicable.
The text talks about the dilution of specialness, arguing that the uniqueness of the matchup is lost. The author says we lose the feeling that certain games exist in their own category.
That phrase, in their own category, is vital. It means that to the fan, there are regular baseball games, and then there are these games.
They don't feel the same.
No, the crowd noise doesn't sound the same. The tension in the stadium is physically different.
But the structural reorganization flattens all of that out.
It does. And to illustrate why this happens, the text relies on a core metaphor that transcends sports entirely. It says, quote, "There's a difference between a song you love and a song that gets played so often it starts to lose its moment."
We have all lived that metaphor.
Oh, absolutely.
You discover a brilliant new song, or you revisit an old favorite, and the first time you hear it, it makes the hair on your arm stand up.
It completely transports you.
But then that exact same song gets licensed for a car commercial.
Yep.
And then it's playing in the background of every grocery store. And it's the hold music when you call your bank.
And what happens to your relationship with the song? The musical notes haven't changed. The singer's voice is identical.
The digital recording is exactly the same file you loved a month ago.
But your emotional relationship to it is entirely degraded.
It really is.
When a song is rare, when you have to actively seek it out, or when it comes on the radio unexpectedly, it functions as an event. You stop what you were doing, you pay attention, and you listen.
Right. But when it is placed on a constant loop in every public space you enter, it ceases to be art.
It becomes auditory wallpaper. It becomes background noise that your brain actively tries to tune out.
So, if we are applying this to the young fan we discussed earlier, we are basically trying to teach them a philosophical lesson. Abundance can sometimes be the enemy of awe.
That is perfectly stated. If you give a human being unlimited, constant access to a delicacy, it ceases to be a delicacy. It becomes a staple.
Right. So the young fan might look at the new optimized schedule and say, "This is fantastic. We get to play our biggest geographic rival 18 times this summer."
Because they just see raw quantity.
Exactly. But the lifelong fan looks at that exact same schedule and thinks, if we play them 18 times, the pitching matchups will get exhausted.
The narratives will be stretched too thin.
Right. And none of those games will feel like a war. They will just feel like a long, repetitive shift at work.
There is a quote in the text that explicitly cements that fear. It says, "You can play a team more often, but that doesn't mean it means more."
Repetition does not equal stakes. Doing something constantly doesn't make it important. It often makes it invisible.
In the realm of neuroscience and memory, repetition actively dilutes importance. The human brain is evolutionarily wired to habituate to frequent, predictable stimuli.
Give me an example of that.
Well, if you walk into a room with a strong odor, after 20 minutes, your olfactory receptors downregulate, and you literally do not smell it anymore.
Oh, wow, right.
If you play a blood rival every other week from April to September, the adrenaline spike dulls. The brain categorizes the event as routine, safe, and expected.
I understand the psychology there, I really do, but I have to push back on the author's underlying premise just a bit.
Go for it.
If frequency dilutes the magic, is the text arguing that tradition inherently requires scarcity?
That's a deep question.
Like, do we actually need long, agonized gaps between matchups for the rivalry to feel authentic? Is suffering through the absence of the games a mandatory requirement for enjoying them?
I wouldn't call it suffering, but anticipation is an undeniable component of the emotional payload.
Anticipation, okay.
If you study the history of these traditional matchups under the old league structure, the long gaps of the offseason and the deliberate stretches of the schedule where the teams avoided each other allowed the narrative tension to build.
So the absence is doing active work.
Exactly. The local sports radio stations argued about it for weeks. The fans debated it. The players anticipated it. The scarcity created a narrative vacuum that was filled with imagination and tension.
And when the teams finally stepped onto the field, all that built-up, unspent energy just exploded.
Right. If you remove the gap, you remove the vacuum, there is no buildup. It's just a continuous, low-grade simmer instead of boiling over.
So the old league structure was like a pressure cooker. You seal it tight, apply heat, and the pressure becomes immense.
Yes.
And this new East versus West frequency model is just taking the lid off the pot and letting the water simmer endlessly on the stove.
The ingredients are still in there, the heat is still on, but the explosive pressure is completely gone.
Which is why the text argues the games lose their moment.
A moment, by definition, requires a specific isolated point in time.
Right. If a moment stretches out continuously for 6 months, it ceases to be a moment. It becomes a state of being.
Exactly. But, the text isn't entirely cynical.
No, it's not. It doesn't just say, everything is ruined at the end, and walk away.
It acknowledges that a calculated trade is being made by the people running the sport.
Right, because if the old magic of scarcity, uniqueness, and league pride is being dismantled, the new system has to offer something compelling in its place.
To keep the fans watching and the television contracts lucrative.
And according to the source, the new system offers a completely different kind of adrenaline. It's a trade-off.
The analysis becomes deeply nuanced here. The text argues that in place of historical uniqueness, the new structural system provides mathematical intensity.
Let's break down that trade-off thoroughly. Emotional legacies versus bracket intensity.
Okay.
Because the new East versus West structure, according to the source, creates significantly more meaningful regular season games that have a direct, immediate impact on playoff paths.
Right. To understand the allure of this new system, we have to contrast the mechanics of the old motivations with the new ones.
Let's do it.
Under the traditional league structure, teams were fighting for league pride and looking to add a new chapter to a decades-long historical narrative.
You wanted to defeat your rival primarily because they were your rival.
Yes. The motivation was largely internal to the relationship between the two franchises. You wanted to beat them because you hated their uniforms, you hated their stadium, and your grandfather hated their grandfather's team.
It was personal. It was deeply tribal.
But the new system fundamentally shifts the motivation. The text notes that new rivalries are forming, or old ones are drastically mutating, because teams are no longer battling for historical bragging rights.
They are now battling for conference control.
Exactly. The stakes have shifted from who owns the historical narrative to who is going to dictate the mathematical playoff bracket.
The text specifically notes that modern rivalries feel urgent because they could determine, quote, who even makes it out of their side of the bracket.
What's fascinating here is the contrast in the types of stakes.
Yeah, the old stakes were built on emotional legacy. The new stakes are built entirely on structural urgency.
The sport has essentially substituted historical weight with mathematical leverage.
Walk me through how that actually works for a fan watching a game today.
Let's look at how the modern playoff algorithm actually functions. Under an East-West bracket system, the top teams in your geographical zone are the only thing standing between you and the championship.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you are a historic American League team or a National League team. You are now just an East team, and your path to survival runs strictly through your time zone.
So if you are trailing a division rival by 2 games in August,
every single game you play against them swings your mathematical probability of making the playoffs by like 8 to 10%.
Wow. It injects the dog days of the regular season with playoff-level panic.
It really does.
The league is basically telling the fans, you don't need 80 years of deep-seated history to care about a random baseball game on a Tuesday night in July, because if your team loses tonight, your statistical chance of postseason survival drops precipitously.
It forces the fan to care through sheer mathematical anxiety.
The intensity of that anxiety is undeniable, and the text freely admits this. It says the new system provides more direct impact on playoff paths and creates games that feel urgent.
When your team's actual survival in the bracket is on the line, Your heart rate naturally goes up. You scrutinize every single pitch. You engage with the product heavily.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though.
Go ahead.
Because as a fan, high-stakes mathematical drama is incredibly fun.
It is.
We live in an era of fantasy sports and advanced analytics. People love tracking daily probabilities and bracket projections. Isn't this just the sport evolving to match how modern audiences consume entertainment?
That's a fair point.
Are we really losing something vital, or are we just trading deep, slow-burn historical beef for fast food, high-stakes drama? Because, I mean, fast food tastes great in the moment.
Fast food does taste great in the moment, but it lacks nutritional value, and it doesn't sustain you long term.
Okay, interesting.
The structural danger of this shift, and the reason the traditionalist mourns it, is the flattening of the season's contrast.
What do you mean by contrast?
If you crank the volume of the regular season up to a 10 by making every single game a desperate, mathematically vital fight for bracket survival,
Yeah.
then when you finally reach the actual playoffs in October, you don't have anywhere louder to go.
Oh, you've maxed out the amplifier in July.
Exactly. The traditional model kept the regular season at a volume of 6 or 7. It relied on a slow-burn historical narrative and the scarcity of interleague matchups to keep people engaged without burning them out.
And then when October arrived, it cranked the volume to 11.
Yes. The contrast between the regular season and the playoffs was stark, majestic, and thrilling.
But if you turn the entire 6-month regular season into a constant state of bracket emergency,
Eventually, the alarm bell just sounds like white noise to the human brain.
and the lifelong fan recognizes this fast food drama for what it is, it's disposable.
Highly disposable.
A mathematically important game, like a game that swings your playoff odds by 10% on a Tuesday, is completely forgotten the moment the season ends and the math resets to 0 for the following year.
Exactly. But a historically important game, an actual clash of league identities, is remembered and debated for 50 years, regardless of what the statistical model said that afternoon.
Math resets every spring, but history accumulates.
That is the crux of the text's argument right there.
Right.
The urgency of bracket survival is, by definition, fleeting. It exists only in the present tense.
Right.
Once the bracket is resolved and the champion is crowned, the urgency of those regular season games vanishes into thin air.
History, however, relies on permanence.
Yes. The old rivalries were built on the permanent, unmoving bedrock of the league structure. The new ones are built on transient mathematical leverage that changes daily.
Which brings us to the ultimate question posed by the source text and the verdict we have been driving toward this entire time.
The big forward-looking question.
Right. We have dissected the past, we have analyzed the mechanical realities of the present structural shift, but looking forward, what does this mean for the next generation of baseball?
The text asks it explicitly. Did we make rivalries better, or did we make them more frequent but less special?
If we look to the future, the critical analytical question we have to answer is whether future franchises can build similar emotional legacies under this new mathematical system.
Right. We know for a fact that the old isolated league system produced legendary, century-defining rivalries.
Will this new geographically optimized high-frequency bracket system do the same?
Or is the very nature of fighting for conference control too sterile, too administrative, to ever inspire mythical, generational hatred?
Let's play out a hypothetical scenario based on the new rules.
Okay.
Say, 2 teams in the new Western bracket battle fiercely for 5 consecutive years. They trade playoff spots, they knock each other out of the bracket, they play incredibly intense, high-stakes games.
Basically, they fulfill every requirement of the new urgency model.
Right. Is that not a legacy?
It is undeniably a rivalry, and it is intense entertainment. But it lacks the architectural permanence of the old system.
Architectural permanence.
Think about the vulnerability of that new rivalry. What happens in year 6 when the league office decides that television ratings are dipping and they need to realign the brackets again to optimize revenue?
Oh, man.
What happens if one of those 2 teams is arbitrarily moved to a different geographic pod to balance the schedule?
The rivalry evaporates instantly because it wasn't based on a shared, immutable identity.
Exactly. It was based purely on the coincidence of proximity and the current mathematical formula of the bracket.
So if new rivalries are formed purely based on the logistical necessity of fighting for playoff positioning within a shifting bracket, they are destined to be transient.
They will never achieve the mythical status of an American League war.
They will just be remembered as that team we had to beat from 2026 to 2030 to make the playoffs, right up until the league changed the rules again.
The analogy that comes to mind is the difference between building a cathedral and pitching a tent.
Oh, I like that.
The old rivalries were cathedrals. You knew exactly where they were located. They took multiple generations to construct. They required immense patience, and they commanded absolute awe when you stood inside them.
And these new bracket-based rivalries are tense.
Yes, you pitch them wherever you need them for the current season. They provide intense, immediate shelter for a while.
But you can pack them up and move them to a new city the second the wind changes direction.
And returning to the text's central assertion that the new rivalries feel urgent, we have thoroughly established that urgency is fleeting while history is permanent.
The lifelong fan looks at this massive structural realignment and realizes that the sport is actively trading its permanent foundation for a series of fleeting, highly profitable adrenaline spikes.
It creates a more consistently intense regular season for the television networks, definitely.
But it fundamentally prevents the deep accumulation of generational memory that made the sport an institution in the first place.
It really makes you wonder if the executives making these structural changes fully comprehend the emotional load-bearing walls they're casually knocking down in the name of optimization.
Before we wrap this up, I want to note that the text ends with a very ominous, almost chilling tease about what it plans to cover next.
Oh, right, the final line.
Yeah. After spending all this time on the emotional and historical toll, the author writes, "Tomorrow we look at the part nobody talks about, the cost of all of this on the body."
It's a profound pivot by the author.
It really is.
It acknowledges that while we have spent our entire session analyzing the psychological cost on the fans and the historical cost to the sport's legacy, there is a very real physical consequence to this structural shift for the athletes actually playing the game.
Because we have focused entirely on the fans' burden today. The loss of the frame, the dilution of the song, the anxiety of the bracket.
But the players are the ones actually caught in the gears of this relentless high-frequency machine.
The league's demand for constant intensity, the removal of the slow-burn historical narrative in favor of a grueling, every game matters urgency, that takes a measurable physical toll on human ligaments and tendons.
It does. But that, unfortunately, is a deep dive for another day.
It perfectly frames the holistic impact of these seemingly administrative changes, though.
Nothing in a complex system happens in isolation.
Exactly. A structural shift designed in a boardroom that rewrites the emotional memory of a fan base is inevitably going to rewrite the physical reality of the players on the field. So, to synthesize our takeaways from this incredibly thought-provoking document, we have explored how the shift from traditional, isolated league structures to a geographically optimized East-West bracket system is fundamentally a massive cultural trade.
The sport is trading historical uniqueness, the permanent cathedrals of the old American and National Leagues, for mathematical intensity, the transient tense of bracket survival.
We have established the critical psychological difference between a matchup that means something historically, carrying the accumulated weight of decades of context and scarcity, versus a matchup that only matters because it dictates immediate, mathematically volatile playoff positioning.
And we hope we have given you, the listener, the language to understand this shift.
Right. Whether you are a lifelong traditionalist who is mourning the loss of the vintage frame holding the painting, or you are a brand new fan who is legitimately enjoying the high-stakes, mathematically urgent adrenaline of the new bracket era.
You now know why the underlying vibe of the sport has fundamentally shifted.
It's not just nostalgia playing tricks on your memory. The physical structure of the container changed, and therefore the meaning of everything inside it changed.
As we close, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
Please do.
Connecting this directly to the concept of generational memory we debated today, if our emotional weight and our historical memories are intrinsically tied to the structural frames that created them, what happens to our collective sports history when the generation that actually lived inside the old frame is gone?
Wow.
When there are no more fans left alive who remember the isolated, closed ecosystem of the American League, will the young fans of today eventually look back on these manufactured, purely mathematical bracket survival games with the exact same blind, romantic reverence that traditionalists hold for the old wars? Or does a history built entirely on transient math eventually just fade into meaningless numbers?
Does the museum survive if all the frames are made of cheap plastic? That is a haunting question to leave on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We will see you next time.